Okay, so welcome to the last talk of the session. Chanwoo Lee from the Department of Philosophy of UCLA is going to talk about metaphysical perspicuity.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'd like to talk about metaphysical perspicuity, or more about give an account of metaphysical perspicuity, and more specifically what it means for a representation to be metaphysically perspicuous. So let's first start with representations in general. It can be any representation. It can be a simple symbol, it can be a word, it can be a sentence, or for a certain formulation of a whole theory. Just anything. And for the sake of the purpose of the conference, yes, we can think of this as scientific representation, but it need not just be scientific representations. So representations tend to succeed or fail. And depending on whether they succeed or fail, we want to attach a certain adjective or quality to it. One good way of labeling them is using truth values. So some representations succeed in virtue of being true. Some of them fail in virtue of being false. So, theory of truth is its own thing, so I won't go deep into this, but for now, let's just assume we can, I think, assume some naive version of correspondence theory, that essentially if it's true, the representation is true, if it gets something right, so it corresponds to the truth, or if it represents the fact, false if not. So this kind of success has to do with what the representation represents. But I think there is also a cross-cutting label or quality that we can ascribe to representations, which has to do with the matter of how. The manner in which a representation represents something. And for this, I propose that we can distinguish between perspicuous and unperspicuous representations. And I propose that it is cross-cutting in the sense that we can distinguish between a true and perspicuous representation versus, sorry, my mistake, this one had to come here. A true yet unperspicuous representation. So, I'm pretty much going to focus on this distinction between, I'm just going to talk on true representations throughout, but I will try to make focus on this difference between perspicuous one and an unperspicuous one, and what it means for there to be this distinction. So I'm not the first one to come up with the term metaphysical perspicuity. So it was also, if you're referring to earlier talk, and for Al's talk, it was mentioned in many literature. And I think the one very classic one comes from Thorne and Corten's 1995 paper, and this is the example or the paradigm that I'm pretty much going to follow. The average American adult man has 2.3 children. Let's say that this is true. I don't know if this is still holds in 2023, but I doubt it. But let's say, in whatever sense, it is true. But are we, especially if we're wearing a philosopher's or a metaphysician's hat, are we 100% on board with that? Maybe we might want to hesitate. And according to Thorne and Cortens, they put it this way: it is merely an unperspicuous way of expressing the fact that the number of children with American fathers divided by the number of American adult males is equal to 2.3. And to more perspicuously represent this statistical fact, you should have better come up with more perspicuous terms, like in terms of statistics, or maybe some probability calculus, or something like that. So this, at least, hopefully gives you an intuitive idea of, okay, what these people are trying to get at. And in fact, the notion has been used more recently as well. So here are some subject matters. For example, in metaphysics, there has been a lot of talk about joint heartedness, going all the way back to Plato, but I think many authors, for example, Sandor and Snyder, have all adopted the term John Carvin's in their talk of metaphysics. And even though they rarely put this together with the term metaphysical perspicuity, I think they still are getting at the same intuition. So I think this is at least one adjacent field, if not the same kind of idea. And more recently, and more explicitly, so in the philosophy of physics, there has been this, especially in the discipline literature on symmetry-related models and stuff like that, there has been some talk about perspicuity, whether perspicuity is ascribed to representation or is ascribed to a formalism, and so on. But in all these cases, despite these applications, from what I've seen at least, there has not been kind of an independent or standalone elucidation of metaphysical perspicuity itself. So I just want to say, okay, I at least want to talk about, okay, let's settle what this means first, and probably talk about its application later. So this is going to be the aim of my talk. So first, I'm going to talk about what metaphysical perspicuity is. So I'm going to give you some of my positive idea or positive characterization of this notion. And then, as a negative part, I will talk about what metaphysical perspicuity is not. So I'm going to talk about some adjacent notions, which are very similar to perspicuity, but yet are still, for various reasons, conceptually distinct. So the first part especially is going to be descriptive. So as I'll talk shortly, so I'm going to write on an existing literature and try to kind of see how the notion has been employed and what kind of characterization we can get from it. And for the latter, it's going to be more revisionary. So I'm going to challenge some, at least, implicit preconceptions we have about this notion. Okay, so let me first start with what metaphysical perspicuity is as a descriptive component. And I get this descriptive component from Jill North's recent book, Physics, Structure, and Reality. And if you were here for the previous talk, yeah, this was discussed in this talk. And yeah, there's going to be overlap there, here and there. So North tries to work on the problem of theoretical equivalence in physics. So again, to rehash the same idea, so there's the venerable classical Newtonian classical mechanics, and it allows two formulations, Lagrange formulation and Hamiltonian formulation. They are considered to be equally true, yet still they're cast in different ways. Non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Again, famously, Schrödinger and Heisenberg picture. I mean, it took Paul Dirac to prove that they are equivalent in an important sense, but still, they are taken to be equally true about the quantum realm in at least some naive sense. So what do we make of this? So are they just like the same thing in the end? And North says, no. So we should, other things being equal, prefer a formulation that most directly corresponds to the nature of the physical world, for this brings with it a level of metaphysical perspicuousness that is preferable. So in her work, at least, the term metaphysical perspicuity or perspicuousness, I mean, there's a slight difference here, but I won't go into that, but at least this seems to be playing a huge role in her work. So I kind of wanted to at least first figure out what is meant by this notion. So based on her work, so I propose that this characterization seems to be adequate at least for the purpose. So a representation is metaphysically perspicuous only if, and perhaps if too, but then like I will try to notice right now, and only if it directly corresponds to the objective features of the world. So this might be a characterization, but this has many pretty strong words there, so I will go one by one. So first, what do you mean by directly corresponding to something, as opposed to indirectly corresponding to something? Okay, about this, North, I think, gives a pretty digestible and intuitive slogan. According to her slogan, there is a difference between what a theory can say and what it does say. So let's say there's a theory, and you can interpret this in one way or another, so that you can gather all this information. But North argues that that's no different from what we can literally get out of the theory, what theory just explicitly says. And that this is kind of a meaningful distinction. Let's see how this distinction applies in our earlier paradigm. The average American adult man has 2.3 children. This allows us to interpret, this can be interpreted in a way that we can get some statistical information out of it. Therefore, we are allowed to say that this statement says such and such and such statistical fact. But this is still this is arguably different from what it literally does say. Saying something about the average American adult man, whatever entity it may be, having 2.3 children, which is not realistic in some sense. So, at least I think this seems to show what the proponents of metaphysical perspicuity or the notion of directness are talking about. That we can at least in some cases make a distinction between what a representation does say versus what it can say. And when we're talking about perspicuity, we care about what it does say, as opposed to what it can say. So that gives us some idea of directness, or directness condition, as I'll call it. So something has to be the representation has to be directly corresponding to something in the world. But what in the world? Another catch is that it has to be the objective features of the world. And here I'm proposing the term objective as something given against subjective. So here, again, North gives a pretty intuitive and simple example. Consider two-dimensional Euclidean plane as its thing in itself. What is the nature of this space? As like we are living the post-Cartesian, we're living the post-Cartesian time, so whenever like two-dimensional Euclidean plane comes up, we naturally visualize this kind of Cartesian coordinate system, which is very useful, and actually North goes on kind of explain why Cartesian coordinate system is distinguished for various such and such reasons. But still, she emphasizes that we impose such coordinate systems as labeling devices. So some of its aspects, even though are more subjective, even though it allows us to latch on something objective, but we should still be reminded of something subjective when we are like attaching these kind of labeling devices to whatever we're trying to represent. So it continues. So the distance between any two points given a choice of unit is the same regardless of the coordinate system. This is a part of the intrinsic objective nature of the space, an aspect of the plane itself apart from our descriptions of it, says North. So when it comes to representation, there might be there's an objective element, and sometimes there's subjective elements. And when we're talking about perspicuity, we want to focus on, at least we want to get as objective as possible. So therefore we have a little better grasp of what this characterization was trying to say, that a representation is metaphysical perspicuous only if it directly corresponds to the objective features of the world. So it has, as a definition, so we have two conditions, directness condition and the objectivity condition. And based on this, here's an offshoot of this facilitation, of this characterization, that metaphysical perspicuity is supposed to facilitate explanation, which especially matters in the philosophy of science context, because, well, philosophers of science or scientists care about explanation. So here's a quote again. The explanation should not bottom out at a brute reference to coordinate systems, but at the nature of the physical reality. Direct formulations are, for analogous reasons, more explanatory. So when we have a metaphysically perspicuous representation, this is supposed to help us, better explain what we're trying to explain, as opposed to something that is merely representationally adequate, something that is true but yet just unperspicuous. So at least this is something we're trying to get out of from the notion of metaphysical perspicuity. So let's just kind of take stock. So I can try to characterize the metaphysical perspicuity in terms of directness, that it is can care about what the representation does say as opposed to what it can say. And it has to do with objectivity as opposed to subjectivity. And that together they should facilitate explanation. So this is what I'm trying to give as a characterization or an account of the notion of metaphysical perspicuity. And as I mentioned, in North's project, in her book, in her general project, it's playing a very substantive role. That is, she takes it to perspicuity as a guide to the nature of the physical world. So do we want to get to know the true nature of the world? Then yeah, perspicuity can be a key for this. And in that respect, it requires us to have the epistemology of perspicuity. And she actually gives her very detailed account of the epistemology of perspicuity. But here, right now, at the moment, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to be neutral about the issue. But as Alice will probably point out later, this might be a very critical issue. But for the time being, I'm going to say that I'm going to be neutral. Then now I'm going to turn to the second part of this talk. What metaphysical perspicuity is not. And this is going to be more revisionary, in the sense that I'm going to challenge some of the implicit preconceptions involved with the very notion in practice. So I'm going to say that metaphysical perspicuity is not fundamentality and is not context independence. This challenges some of the use of metaphysical perspicuity in the literature. For example, when it comes to fundamentality, especially considering the notion of joint carvingness in metaphysics. For example, Ted Steiner used the term joint carvingness and fundamentality interchangeably. So, given that the term joint carvingness and perspicuity seem to be pretty close, so my account at least challenged some of the preconceptions around the literature. So I'm going to give some arguments as to why these two notions are still different from metaphysical perspicuity. So let me start with fundamentality. And let's consider another paradigm where fundamentality seems to play some role. Some rough version of physicalism, basically saying that nature is at bottom just all physical. All the other things are derivative or non-fundamental. For example, theory of economics, which part of social science, and this may be about something real, very objective, but still, insofar as we buy into physicalism, what underlies economics is physics, and especially maybe some kind of particle physics. I won't try to dabble in it, but let's say that this is at least in charge of everything in economics, deep down. Of course, giving a detailed story about this connection is a whole other thing, which I'll not go into, so I'm just going to put it as some kind of very vague metaphysical link. And here, let me appeal to some authority, some old authority, namely the classical Fodorian, the special sciences kind of case. Now let's think about dealing with some economic phenomena, or some of the recent inflation, or any of these events. Which one is, so we have a theory of economics and then we have a theory in particle physics. Which one is better suited to deal with this kind of phenomena? So if we follow this old Fodorian diagnosis, then it has to be economics. It directly addresses economic phenomena, and for that reason, presumably even more explanatory. Whereas, I mean, it isn't clear if particle physics can say anything about economic phenomena at all, but even if it does somehow, it's going to be very roundabout. And for some reason, the intended area that you're concerned with is the micro-physical substrate of economic agents who are engaging in such and such inflation or something like that. Yeah, in that case, still, that domain is very strange, but particle physics would be more suited. But otherwise, if we're just talking about regular economic phenomena, then it should be economics that offers a better account of it. Based on this, which one offers a more perspicuous representation? Economics or particle physics? And so my verdict is the former, economics. So I want to give two brief arguments in favor of this. Why it is a non-fundamental theory, namely economics, that turns out to be more perspicuous. First, we can attempt some very simple conceptual analysis of metaphysical perspicuity as we characterize it. So earlier we characterized it in terms of directness, objectivity, etc., etc. And nowhere does this involve the term fundamentality. It requires there to be a real objective reality out there, but it doesn't presume that that objective reality has to be fundamental. If, for some independent reason, you think that only the fundamentalia are real, then, well, this might not be the case. But insofar as you believe that there can be a real yet derivative entity or layer out there, then conceptual analysis does not forbid ascribing metaphysical perspicuity to a non-fundamental theory. And if we attempt some kind of brief conceptual engineering, the problem becomes even more acute. So, metaphysical perspicuity was brought up because we were concerned with facilitating explanation. But if we buy into the Fodorian paradigm we just considered, then it's economics, not particle physics at the given context. That's giving more explanation. So the term or the concept of metaphysical perspicuity should be engineered in a way that it should allow non-fundamentality to be perspicuous as well. So for both of these reasons, I suggest that perspicuity and fundamentality may overlap to a certain extent, but do not completely overlap. And theory of economics can be a good example of this. And then, so I just talked about fundamentality, and let's talk about content independence. So I will argue that metaphysical perspicuity can be context dependent for that reason. So here I'm going to borrow this case study from Alyssa Coklash's study on water, a seemingly simple chemical substance. And she suggests, she kind of very well illustrates how water can be subject to multiple equally good perspectives. Or, for example, there are many continuum representations of water. And there are quantum representations of water. And there are classical atomic representations. And note that there's representations, because even within this, there are at least 4 different classical atomic representations. And the thing is, they all seem to get something very good out of water. And nothing seems to top another in a good sense. Because each of them offers their good explanation on its own context, depending on what our interest is. Therefore, she argues, depending on which properties of water sciences want to explain, they will choose a different representation. Which seems that which representation we should want to choose is context dependent. And I argue that in this case, depending on what we want to focus on all these very different kind of representations can be, in a certain sense, equally, all can be perspicuous given a certain context. If we are under the context of where classical atomic representations work, then this is the weight, this is more perspicuous, but in another context, it might not be. So let me give you kind of a brief rundown of the arguments. So I already kind of like briefly mentioned that perspicuity is determined relative to the intended domain. So I just mentioned how, say, the phenomenon of economic phenomenon itself, and for somehow when we want to talk about the metaphysical substrate of economic phenomena, that might be a different story. So it needs to be determined relative to the intended domain anyway. And so what determines the intended domain? So what do we intend to look at? This is where context can naturally come in. The context can determine what scientists want to study at the given moment, what they want to pay attention to. So in that sense, a context can determine which one is the intended domain. So in this sense, I want to say that the earlier characterization of perspicuity naturally accommodates context dependence because the context can determine which one we're intending to look at. And in this sense of context dependency does not imply agent's dependency or subjectivity. And because like agent dependency or subjectivity can definitely compromise metaphysical perspicuity, as I characterized earlier, because, well, in that case, it is no longer objective. But context dependency does not compromise objectivity. For example, let's say again here's water, and we are interested in a certain feature of water, let's say fluidity. In the given context, let's say for some context like we got funding, science got funding to study some of the fluidity of water molecules or something like that. And then, given the context, there is a certain representation which may not work for all contexts, but works at a given context. But does it make fluidity by itself any more subjective? It doesn't seem to be so. Because fluidity remains an objective feature of water throughout, whether some scientists want to work on it or not. But the context gets determined at a certain point which one we want to look at. And in this sense, context can change whether some representation is perspicuous or not, which is still irrelevant to the objectivity issue. So, for this reason too, I want to suggest that perspicuity and context independence do have some overlap, but it's not always the case. For example, contextualized representation of water is one case. So these are very different representations. May not all be perfectly perspicuous, but still, to a certain extent, they can be metaphysical perspicuous to a certain degree. So therefore we have this. So let me give a recap of the whole thing. So today I talked about what metaphysical perspicuity is in terms of directness and objectivity. And I talked about how this is meant to support the facilitation of explanation. And I talked about the case of negative component, namely, it is not necessarily fundamentality, and it is not necessarily context independence. So, to wrap up, two kind of lessons I want to draw from this. First, I want to show that metaphysical perspicuity is a sui generis notion that is distinct from other neighboring notions, such as fundamentality and so on. And therefore, I want to suggest that metaphysical perspicuity can be a new, useful addition to the philosopher's toolbox. This is all I have. Thank you very much.
Now, Alex, LeBrun.
Thanks, Chanwoo. That's a really fun paper. I think he does a really nice exploration into this concept that's beginning to shoulder a lot of weight in at least contemporary philosophy of physics. And so what I want to do is kind of set the stakes for this paper, and then I have a couple of further questions that one of them is unfair. But I count myself among the skeptics for metaphysical perspicuity to do the job that I'm about to lay out that it's meant to do. So the literature on theoretical equivalence in physics, people who read the last talk know what this is, or know a little bit, is concerned with the question of when two theories are equivalent with each other in the sense of saying the exact same thing about the physical world. Physicists will sometimes assert that two formulations of a theory are actually the same theory in two different guises. The most famous example of this is perhaps the equivalence between wave and matrix quantum mechanics. Here are some of the competing motivations in this literature that has led people to appeal to metaphysical perspicuity. So we start with a broad strokes version of naturalism. Jill North says, quote, "We should take the mathematical structures of our best physical theories seriously in telling us about the nature of the physical world." So one way to take the mathematical structure seriously is this. We look to cases where physicists treat and assert that two theories are equivalent, and we determine the relationship between the mathematical structures associated with those two theories. In the cases of interest, there's going to be some formal mathematical relationship that holds between these associated mathematical structures, like having the same category of models, or being intertranslatable, or being definitionally equivalent. This then gives us a natural story for theoretical equivalence when two theories say the same thing. Namely, two theories are equivalent just in case they're empirically equivalent and they bear this formal mathematical relationship to one another, the properties. More or less the period between 2010 and 2020 was comprised of people debating what this proper formal relation is. But there's a worry with this approach, and this worry is rooted originally in Putnam and Goodman. So if, as it turns out, there are two theories that look really different, but according to this standard of equivalence that we get by reflecting on physics, they're actually the same, it seems like we can't get a complete picture of the fundamental nature of the physical world. So we have to give up on some form of metaphysical realism if we take seriously the mathematical structure that North wants to. So we're stuck, right? On the one hand, we want to take seriously the practices of physicists in line with scientific realism, and on the other, we want to have a univocal statement of the nature of physical reality and avoid this underdetermination problem. So in comes Jill North with her most recent book. North distinguishes between two senses of equivalence. On the one hand, theories can be informationally equivalent, roughly when they are empirically equivalent and when they bear the proper formal relation to one another. This is what theories can say in Chanwoo's terminology, which is actually Jill's. So informational equivalence is when two theories can recover all the same physical facts or something like that. Nevertheless, North argues that there may still be a metaphysical difference between these two theories. So this is where metaphysical perspicuity comes in. Metaphysical perspicuity is meant to be a way for the metaphysician of science to break the tie between two informationally equivalent theories. So it's a metaphysical virtue that we can appeal to decide between two theories. That's where the debate stands for Chanwoo's exploration into the concept of perspicuity. So one formulation of a theory, or one theory, is metaphysically perspicuous if it more directly corresponds to the nature of the physical world than another formulation. Chanwoo argues that perspicuity is distinct from fundamentality, and also that perspicuity might be context-dependent based on the intended domain. I think Chanwoo does a really good job of carefully walking through cases where perspicuity might and might not better explain the superiority of one theory over another. And he argues for two claims about perspicuity that I think are correct. First, Chanwoo suggests that perspicuity explains why an economics theory is superior to explaining economic phenomena than a theory formulated in fundamental physics, even if one might supervene on the other. I agree with this. Perspicuity is distinct from fundamentality. Second, he argues that by reflecting in the paper on the same example from economics, but here the case with water, whether one formulation is perspicuous over another is dependent on the domain that one is inquiring into. Again, I think Chanwoo is right here, that perspicuity might be context-dependent. I have to think more about the water case. That's a fun one. With both of these clarifications, though, I worry that they walk offer little insight into how perspicuity can be used to adjudicate between informationally equivalent theories like North does. So to the first clarification that he makes, informationally equivalent theories are plausibly always at the same level of fundamentality. And so if two theories are informationally equivalent and one is more perspicuous than another, this automatically entails that perspicuity is distinct from fundamentality. So I worry that it can't help us break the tie between these cases to know that perspicuous theories don't differ, may not differ, do differ, might differ in fundamentality. To the second case, informationally equivalent theories plausibly have the same intended domain. Again, I don't think Chanwoo is wrong that perspicuity might be context dependent, but I worry that the skeptic of perspicuity won't find things sufficiently clarified. Okay, that's my general worry about the dialectic here. I do have one real question that is definitely unfair, but I think it's important to ask. So Chanwoo in the paper explicitly says he does not take a stand on the methodological aspect of North's account, quote, how to determine the metaphysical perspicuity of a scientific representation without first presupposing what the objective features of reality are. So it's unfair that I'm going to ask you about the thing you said you're not going to talk about. But I worry that this is somewhat sidestepping the most important worry for even taking perspicuity seriously in the first place. So here's what I mean. In order to know, or in order to even say that one theory more perspicuously represents the world, more directly corresponds to the objective features of the world, we must know what those objective features are. If all we have are two formulations, how can we know that one more directly represents the objective features of the world? So I think essential to this project of investigating perspicuity is the epistemological worry. And in principle, perspicuity only works if we already know what the underlying objective features of reality are. So my question is, can we take seriously the concept of perspicuity without answering the epistemological question of knowing what the objective features of the world are like in the first place? But thank you, this is a great paper. Good work.
Thanks for a very kind and very on point my questions. So exactly. So I think both are right. I think Alice was essentially right that I did not address this, was not able to address this problem, and I still actually do not have a good answer. And because here's my background. So definitely, can I use a board here? Yeah. So, especially in the case of North, as Alice rightly pointed out, so it was starting with perspicuity and going to reality. That's was what was trying to be she was trying to achieve there, and pretty much what's going on from my understanding in many areas of philosophy of physics. But my background was that I kind of came to interest in this notion for a very different reason, because I am working on my dissertation project is actually on philosophy of mathematics, which has to do with structuralism, and also I have been interested in some works on ontological nihilism. And in those cases, I would have to think about the opposite direction. That okay, so let's for some reason we are convinced about this reality, what the realities are like, and what kind of representation is most suitable for some reason. For example, when it comes to structuralism, there's an issue about okay, for some reason we're convinced that mathematics is by nature structural. Then set theory versus category theory versus homotopy type theory, which one is the best representation? And I thought, oh, this is metaphysical perspicuity, which I picked up from reading North, can be pretty useful, but it was going the opposite direction. So for that reason, I was trying to avoid this problem, and I think it was Alice's very right to point out that, well, maybe at least here in the metaphysics of science context, this is the more critical problem. And yeah, I do agree. But at least this was my kind of being defensive. But I want to just give some speculation about how this may proceed. So I guess I imagine that Joe North has provided much more established account for this. But here's one speculation. I think So unless, like, maybe if we go all the way to the Putnamian or these like model theory argument, maybe this is going too far. But so unless we're going that far, maybe we can at least agree that in some cases, maybe we just have a theory that is kind of invocable, I think. No, probably actually I don't know. But maybe if there is, let's take that in some scientific theories, actually there is one preferred formulation that whether for pragmatic reason or whatever reason I think is considered to be, oh, this is telling us the right stuff. And yet there need not be much fuss about like which one is more perspicuous or not. And I think like if there is at least some agreement about that, or at least like, so this is just anecdotal, so I don't exactly remember the reason why, but I remember I was talking to some philosopher of physics, and they're saying, oh, I like the Schrödinger picture better because in the matrix mechanics because of like such and such reasons. So I don't exactly remember the reason why, but unless, I mean, this might just be a pragmatic issue, but I think like maybe sometimes such practical elements might be telling us about something, and maybe our epistemology can be inductively construed in a way that, okay, let's say if we have some, based on these agreed instances, let's try to come up with some good criterion or epistemological account of perspicuity. So yes, this might be inductive, and which might have been wrong throughout, but I think this is at least a possible one step one might take. But as I was talking, I just realized that, yeah, maybe actually there might be no such completely agreed upon instance where we have a good representation, so, but I just like thought that this could be a hypothetical approach, but now I was talking, I'm not very sure if that was going to work. But yeah, so this is all I had for like comments, was really helpful, and I need to think more about that. Thanks a lot.
Here's a challenge to the view, I think. It looks like there are representations that are less metaphysically perspicuous in your sense, but more explanatory. And so it looks like this might challenge that connection to explanatoriness, right? So these are cases where you explicitly idealize away from what's happening, and so you introduce a whole bunch of falsehoods. So what the thing does say is, strictly speaking, less true than a model that says, that doesn't have the idealizations. But at least on some of these accounts, for some of these idealizations, the idealized picture is more explanatory. So Batterman's got some nice examples of this, but there are lots of them in the literature. So that looks like a prima facie challenge. So
yeah, great, thank you. So that's like absolutely the case, and even for this one, for which I borrowed from Booklish, even though I think in this paper, like she doesn't employ an idealization language per se, but this is involved idealization. So this is my speculation at this point. So I think like idealization is an issue, or approximation is an issue, because it involves falsity, right? So my speculation is that perhaps in the case of idealization, maybe that might be a false, yet because like in many cases, even when there's idealization, idealization tends to be useful because it still latches onto some very relevant features of the like represented system. So my speculation maybe actually, so I earlier drew this like 4 quadrants, and maybe some cases where idealization leads to explanation may be a false and perspicuous case, because in the sense it still gets on to really something, even though it contains falsity. So that's what I'm trying to kind of think of, but yeah, it's very speculative at this point. So I think but that's a very important problem that I was wrestling with.
That's really interesting. I think I agree that in principle there's no problem with having non-fundamental or perspicuous representations of things that are non-fundamental. I think the water example is like a better example than the economics example, just to me. So I guess the objectivity criterion is what I'm thinking of. So I'm a little skeptical of the idea that there's like some determinate set of like fundamental microstates that would like correspond to like certain like economic situations. And although it's true that we'll get like a better, more satisfying explanation in terms of economics versus fundamental physics, I wonder if that's because economics is kind of made out of our concepts, and to speak loosely. So explanations phrased in that way are going to obviously make more sense, and not to mention how intractable the alternative would be. But I just wonder if there might be like a bit of a conflation between the vehicle and content of like the concepts, right? So like, true, there's, we have these concepts, and on a tiny scale, we're fundamental physical entities, but like neurologically, whatever's going on in our brains reduces to that, but like the content, like supply and demand, like is there some like fundamental basis for inflation? Probably not, in my opinion, but like maybe the mental states, the vehicle rather than the content have that reduction. Yeah. And that doesn't seem to be the case with the water example.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I definitely here assume that some case, like it's now thinking about it spooky. So I was assuming that okay, the economic phenomena can be objective, or it has objective features. So in the sense of, but like that's maybe, especially, but like since I assumed kind of this physicalism, so depending on how I frame it, yeah, that might be a big assumption. But like, so I think like that's perhaps that's very appropriate. But at least what I was assuming that like yes, so it might, even regardless of its like very micro level substrate, like yeah, let us assume that in whatever form the economic phenomena on its own has its objectivity, it is like objectively existing. Like so that was kind of what I was assuming, but like maybe, I guess as a Reddit point, that's like a big if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, like I guess there could be, like I guess I'm also skeptical that there would be like some determinate like set of like microstates that would like correspond to like a certain economic situation. And then I guess it's a separate point about the the vehicle content.
Right.
Concepts, but that's just
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll have to think more about that piece.
Yeah.
Thanks. So it's not really a question, it's not really a comment, it's just kind of puzzlement on my part. So I'm seeing a bit of tension between the idea of context dependence and perspicuity. To me, they seem intuitively just not to go well together. Well, perspicuity, according to your account of perspicuity, is about joint carvingness, among other things, right? A direct access to the joints of nature. Whereas context dependence is about things like, you mentioned, intended domains or perspectives or interests or explanatory objectives and so on. That's not about joints, that's about intentions and purposes relative to various explanatory schemes and so on. So I think, well, can you have both? I mean, if you're looking to carve nature at the joints, then perspectives or context don't really have anything to do with it. It's just you either carve it at the joints or you don't. But if you really want to talk about context dependence in trying to get access to kind of the objective features, then it seems to me the joints of nature are not going to really be there. It's going to be picking out certain aspects. And so I was thinking about, like, with the water example, well, I understand the way one can talk and say, well, if you're looking at the water quantum mechanically, then there's a bunch of this, there's this going on. But if you're looking at it in terms of fluid dynamics, then there's this going on. Well, these are not additions of being, right? It's not like there's one thing being added to another and that's water. It's just you're talking about the same stuff, but from different perspectives, whatever that means. Then are you really carving anything at the joints, or is it a case of like picking out, irrespective of context, but just saying you could pick out these properties and you can pick out these properties, and it really doesn't matter whether you're interested in them, or it doesn't matter whether you have an explanatory objective, it doesn't matter whether there's any particular context, it's just there are the quantum mechanical properties of water, there are the fluid dynamical properties of water, and maybe there are a bunch of other properties of water too, and you can sum them all up in a way because they're different properties, and you can put them all together and say, and that's water. then it's not really about context. It's just about here are these properties, here are these properties, here are these properties, and carve nature of the joints by taking them all together, and the joints are basically where the properties are, and then the divisions between the properties, whether it's levels or scales or whatever. So I guess, sorry, it's not a coherent question. It's just simply, I'm worried that you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're wanting to say there is such a notion of perspicuity which covers the nature of the joints, but on the other hand, it's all context dependent. I just find it hard to see how you know both, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry if I'm not making sense there.
No, it's a real problem that I was like trying too hard to kind of figure out myself, and which I said more in the paper version. So the one thing is, which I think I mentioned that. So I kind of intended perspicuity to be a more or less degree kind of thing. So for that reason, that's why I was very hesitant to say that in the water. So something can be perfectly 100% perspicuous and context dependent at the same time. I think I'm intended to think that maybe in those cases, unless you have like you accept like kind of the dapple world kind of ontology, then perhaps if it's like 100% perspicuous, then probably it has to be context dependent. But I was thinking, but at least let's say we're thinking about like 0.5 perspicuous, if that makes any sense. Like then. I also gave some like independent motivations for why we might want to think in degree theoretic ways, but in that case I was thinking that, well, maybe degree, why not? And I think like there's room for context dependence. That's kind of what I want to suggest. And I think you made a great point about, okay, so maybe what you described as the context dependent nature of perspicuities, well, like, so that's because we're not talking water per se, but just a certain component, certain part of water. And actually, if you just put them together as water, then you just only have one single thing and single context. I need to think more about that, but I think at least I want to suggest that, well, like maybe that's way of maybe fine-grained way of seeing things could work, but at the same time maybe we can have a little more coarse-grained would be well in certain contexts. So that is I think something of what I want to say at the moment, but it needs to be fleshed out further. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. So it's kind of two related points I have. One of them kind of shared worry here, except with respect to the idea of like explanation as the role of perspicuity, and that being not only kind of bringing in maybe this emphasis on context dependence, but maybe bringing back subjectivity in a way, and that like explanation, at least how I'm understanding it, is always like explanation for someone or some group with a set of kind of beliefs, knowledge, concepts. And in order for something to be a successful explanation, that might rest on some of the contingencies about the kind of thing that you were explaining something to, right? And so why something succeeds or fails as an explanation, in addition to the context. And kind of relatedly, I was curious about what makes the examples of water, fluidity, and economics metaphysical perspicuity, rather than just about these kind of other theoretical virtues involving explanation, the way that you bring things out. Especially like with the water fluidity example, it was hard for me to grasp like what was the metaphysically perspicuous thing.
I see. So, let me start with the second question. That I think. So the idea that I caught was probably I should have more used quotes, but it was about I don't know. Perhaps it was not exactly joint carving kind of like language, but something along the line of that was used in Bullich's paper when it comes to saying, okay, why these representations, despite being context dependent, still get to something and be explanatory. Right? So that was like, okay, the similar idea is going on about directly representing at least a partial nature of something. So that's why I thought the idea of metaphysical perspicuity can be kind of useful way of capturing that kind of idea. So that's why I went for that, if that explains. And the first one, explanation as being subjective. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it, at least so as
as you saw, so I definitely assume that explanation to be more or less, it might be context dependent but not subjective. And so that was kind of, I think that was at least what I was assuming as I was reading the literature. For example, in some ontic conception, some proponents of the ontic conception explanation go on to say that, well, like explanation is there objectively, whether we like it or not. Like, so I was, and there are some other dissenters to that, and I was trying to be neutral on that, but at the same time, just I was absorbing those kind of experiences. So I was, I think, more or less did not think much more about like whether how subjective elements can go on to influence explanatory nature as well. So I have to think more about that. But yes, I think at least you rightly point out that that wasn't the scope of my work, and perhaps I have to think about whether those like elements there.
This is just a question about how about relative fundamentality, or it could be more or less fundamental, and whether being more perspicuous about something, especially if it was more perspicuous through being more direct, might be connected with being more fundamental than the indirect thing. So, because in the case you gave, like the average rank command thing, you said, well, you know, what that can say is something about the ratios. So numbers, but what it does say something about some other entity, the average rank command, whatever that is, and then by that indirectly, that's the thing it can say. You know, I think, well, that thing and that entity depends on just the ratio between the children you have. In order, I don't have to generalize from like that example, but I was wondering how is that always going to be true when you have something that says one thing but can be used to say indirectly say another, that then that would be because the truth of the thing it does say depends on the truth of the thing it can say, and if so, then is there some connection between not fundamentality like science or stuff, but between the independence of all?
Yeah, thank you. I think in the average children case, absolutely, I think that's the case. But so that's why, in some cases, definitely danger overlap. But that's why I kind of try to belabor on the Victorian case of economists, where I think at least in this case, well, it doesn't. It seems like when we're ascribing perspicuity to the theory of economics, well, then it's still. Even in terms of relative fundamentality, maybe we should give hands to like a less fundamental kind of representation. At least that's what I was trying to achieve. Does that kind of address your?
Yeah, I mean, but I guess the worry is whether there are things you can say about particle physics that counter say something like the same thing as a sort of connected to
I see. Yeah.
Because if not, then actually just insofar as you're able to say things about the economic stuff, the more conspicuous things will be. There's almost a less conspicuous things.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for that reason, I think like definitely it's up to your ontology. So whether we want to leave room for real yet non-fundamental stuff. And I think that's a big if, and there's disagreement about that, but so if there's indeed, like, everything real, truly real or fundamental, then yes, they are going to overlap. But I think I just want to make that, well, at least intentionally, I don't know if that or if there's a conceptual distinction we might want to draw, even though they end up, like, being extensionally thought.
We have 2 more questions and 2 more minutes, so if they are short, we can fill
Yeah,
up
I'm going to
space.
scratch my question.
You are not going to.
Yeah, well, I'll talk. I'll talk to you.
Do you can answer?
Sure. Sort of following up Alex's question a couple of other ones. Why is this metaphysical perspicuity? And the reason I'm asking is, so start off with some 2 theories that appear to be empirically equivalent. In perspicuity, one of its jobs was supposed to be to decide between them if they're equivalent in a very strong sense. There's nothing a scientist is going to do to be able to distinguish them. So then along comes metaphysical perspicuity. But all of the cases that you're looking at, it looks as if scientists really have no problem thinking. I mean, there are going to be some dickering about, well, economics and its own domain and stuff like that. But it's not going to be a non-scientific issue. So that's why I'm wondering, where's the metaphysical part of this?
Okay. All right. So, thanks. So
Yeah, so the primary reason being, oh yeah, I just follow the conventions. It seems like people are talking about metaphysical perspicuity, so yeah, it was just the, I just follow what was in the market in certain sense. But in the second sense, I kind of especially wanted, so I was like told that at least, but you want to have some kind of qualifier there, like somebody said as ontological. So I think like ontological perspicuity or, you know, objective perspicuity or whatever qualifier there may be. I think like I was told that there had to be something there because one just went with perspicuity one time. So I actually did not know about this, but it seemed like I didn't know that the English adjective perspicuity in often says it's just, oh, that means easy to understand, right? So it's all subjective. So I want to say, okay, at least that's not what I'm talking. So I want to have some qualifier, and it seemed like people were attached the M word to that physical. So I just went along with that, but maybe I might want to explain more about that. So.